So in Singapore, a big buzzword is yellow privilege or Chinese privilege.
Oh, I haven't heard that before.
All right, guys, welcome to another episode of Visual Inconsideration's flagship series, Inconsiderate Insights. So you know the usual crew. We've got me, Zeke, Iqbal, and now our dear bro over here, John, of the Fun Bros. But today we've got two new guests joining us. One is Natalie Cheung, creator
Hi.
of Hey Natalie, right?
What up? What up? What up?
So
What up?
all the way from the UK. Today we have all the children of the colonies who are joining us today. Right? So we got right? So Natalie has created a Yellow Bee podcast. Or is it the Yellow Bee Pod podcast? How
Call
is
it
that
whatever
going?
you want. Yellow Bee Pod. Yeah.
Oh, we'll follow the nomenclature, right? But Yellow Bee podcast, right? And we'll be hearing a lot about her very unique podcast that deals a lot with issues of the East and Southeast Asian diaspora, especially as they surround the UK. And then also from the UK, we have Christian Escobar, all right, all-round creative, who will be sharing with us his plans to come to Asia and maybe bunk in one of our homes. Right, so we got you covered.
Yes, definitely.
So Natalie, how about we kick it off by you telling us why Yellow Bee? What inspired the name of this podcast?
Oh, what inspired the name? So when I was, this is dumb, I don't know whether I've told this to anyone. When I was in secondary school, in high school, my friends used to call me Nata Bee because I was always busy, like busy bee. So that's the bee. Yellow, if other people are going to call me Yellow, I get to call myself Yellow as well. So trying to reclaim the word Yellow Bee.
What's it? Okay, so we have Asian American here in our podcast, and we are Singaporean Asians. Although I don't think the hyphen there is quite necessary. But what's it like? What do you think is the biggest difference viewing like a British Asian experience when you're watching the American Asian experience? Like, what do you think is the biggest difference that you can kind of spot or feel? And
well, obviously, I don't know what it's like to be Asian American, so I can only speak to sort of what I hear about or what I see from other people's experiences. But here in the UK, it does feel like the community is not as established, even though there's a huge Chinese population here, as well as other Asian countries. But somehow, I don't know, I feel like we're more separated, we're not as established, and we don't have our own community and culture in quite the same way. Other people might disagree with me, but that's my experience as someone who is British-born Chinese.
John, what about
you? I guess it's interesting because I think I feel the same way as an Asian American. I feel like ever since growing up, you just feel like you don't really see people on the screen and film and television that look like yourself, that you can relate to. And a lot of the times you end up turning towards outsourced content to just like view things that might be similar to yourself, whether it be like K-pop or like K-dramas or like foreign films in Asia. It's like that's literally where you would go sometimes to consume content. But I don't know. I mean, maybe it's different in the UK. Like, would you say you experience? I'm just curious. Did you experience like any racism growing up? Did you experience like? Do you, as a Chinese or an Asian person, do you really feel like an outsider? I mean, like, I guess I would feel like an outsider in the US, but it's like a 4 out of 10, like a 5 out of 10 in terms of severity. I don't know. It just seems like it gets pretty severe in the UK. Like, if you had to get into the differences a bit, like, how severe would you say? As an outsider, did you feel like growing up and now?
I guess like growing up, I did grow up in like a very like white neighborhood, which I think is a pretty common story for a lot of Asians here across the country. And I guess I'm really good at assimilating and pretending to be white. Like even other British-born Chinese people call me a banana. So again, my experience can only represent like what my own experiences and feelings, not all British-born Chinese people or even let alone all Asians. In the UK, I think there definitely is a lot of racism, and it's sometimes like under the surface, which is something that we've seen come out a lot over the last week, just like that lack of understanding. Just because you don't say like a slur doesn't mean that you're being not racist. Like, it is completely different. And it wasn't until I was older that I really recognized, like, what does it actually mean to be Chinese? Who am I? You know, everyone has these battles with their own sense of belonging and identity. And yeah, I think you're right in saying that we look for the content that represents us. And for some people, it's like Korean music, Korean dramas. But for me, it was actually like Asian American content.
Was that mostly because of language? Was there a language barrier? Like, how conversant are you, Natalie? Like, in what's your native dialect?
I speak a little bit of Cantonese, and I went to Chinese school growing up to learn Mandarin, but pretty much know nothing. So,
why do you think there's no UK-based creators? Like, why do you think no one's like trying to, I don't know, be a YouTuber or be like in film and television? Like, why are there not those people trying to do that?
I think people would argue with that and say that there definitely is like that sense of community and those creators here, but maybe they're not as big because the UK is just generally a smaller country than the US. So in terms of if you're trying to compare follower counts, it might be very different. But maybe Christian will have something more to say about this because you're in the creative space, who you haven't introduced, by the way.
Yeah. Christian, go for it.
Actually, no, actually, I have a lot to put into that. So I did notice that back in the day, because I actually started my creativeness, my creative field on YouTube. Actually, in 2009, I had a YouTube channel with 10,000 subscribers, and me being from England, I kept getting described as Timothy De La Ghetto. Everyone used to comment, "You're the British Timothy De La Ghetto," right? Yeah. So it was weird because
I can't see it though, like.
Because I had that vibe.
Is that a compliment or an insult?
Yeah, he's cool, man.
I mean, he was big back then. Timothy.
Yeah, man. 2009, you were like ahead of the curve.
Oh, 100%. So like, no, not that way. It was more. I think it was my personality and how like easygoing and like just being able to talk about any topic without any issues, right? So everyone used to compare me and stuff, but what I saw is that there wasn't a sense of community back then, because although I am originally Colombian, most of my friends are Asians, and actually a lot of people think I'm Asian myself. And you know, back then you would see all these YouTubers who were singers. There was like this huge Asian crowd back in the day who were singers, and there's none of that in England, right? Now, when you see YouTube in the UK, there's so many creators, but there isn't an established Asian community on YouTube here from the UK. And I think that's still quite prevalent. Which I myself, when I think about getting into YouTube, I always think more on the travel side of things, because where I'm from, my area, you can't find many creators. They're all in central London or maybe Essex or something like that. And they're more maybe like beauty gurus or more, you know, people who do vlogs and stuff like that. But there isn't, you know, like the Just Kidding Films type of vibe or the Funk Bros type of vibe. You know what I mean? That's more like an LA, California thing. And that still lacks very much here in London, that sense of community.
I think for me, it's like, I wish that more people would create Asian American content, because culturally speaking, I don't think we grew up in, and I think I'm speaking from the American perspective, so just let me know how you guys feel, but like culturally in Asian America, we're not raised to value being entertainers or doing things or creating content. Like, none of our parents did this as a job ever in their lives, right? Because most of us were immigrants from Asia. And so what you see is like the people that get into entertainment are usually the people that kind of just like either didn't want to follow their parents' lead or just like really, really stood out for different reasons. But at the same time, you had to actually really be exposed to the cultural capitals of the world in America. Like, you got to kind of be from either LA or New York and really have like kind of some type of connections to it, or just like really, really want it, you know? That's why it's like, even in America, even though we have these creators, like we don't really have like that many. To me, I still feel like our story is undersold in a lot of ways. And that's why it's also like, when you see a lot of things going on in society right now, it's like, who is a central voice that can speak up on our behalf to stand up for ourselves if there's people that are you know, being racist towards us, being violent towards us. Like it's obviously a different subject, but like it's so challenging sometimes. And that's why it's like I wanted to kind of like even like talk to people with like you guys like in Singapore and the UK. It's just like what is a better solution? Like obviously in Singapore, if you're Asian, you don't even deal with a lot of these issues to an extent. But then obviously there's a whole that was part of the discussion last week. And in the UK, it's just like I think it's just good to hear like that perspective, because it's like, well, at least we have a culture in America to an extent. But what can we do to make things better? I guess like that's kind of what set at least part of my goal in terms of these conversations was just like, what are some things we can take away from other countries that give you perspective in terms of like maybe being able to become a better creator as an Asian person around the world. Like it's very different and very fragmented no matter where you go.
Yeah, I wish we had the answers here in the UK to give you, but okay, my first tip would be grateful for what you have, because at least you have something. I definitely feel like there's a stronger community and more voices than there are in the UK. And especially like over the last like month or so, and since starting my own podcast, like I've been trying to think, who are the East and Southeast Asian British voices? Who are they? And maybe Christian, you'll have some ideas, but for me it's like Gemma Chan, Henry Golding, that's pretty much it.
Right.
I really don't know who's out here speaking. Like they might be Asian, but if they never acknowledge their ethnicity or if they're mixed heritage, if they never acknowledge that, I wouldn't really see them as a voice for Asian people. And I'm talking specifically around East and Southeast Asians. Christian, is there anyone that you think that I haven't listed who is a voice for Asians in the UK?
It's literally same as you, because I'm trying to think at the top of my head and only those two come up. So,
yeah, and Henry Golding's brand new. He was a nobody until a year and a half ago.
Crazy Rich Asians.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fuck, I thought he was Singaporean, to be honest with you. I didn't even know that.
I think he's like British Malaysian.
Yeah, he's British.
He's Malaysian, yeah.
Yeah.
So would you say that? Yeah. So I just want to jump in. So when you mentioned like they don't acknowledge that their culture and all that is from Asian, is it like something that they choose to not acknowledge, like, or based on the background? What do you think about that?
No, I guess when I think growing up, there were like a few Asian people on screen. Christian, I'm gonna throw some names out here. There might be some throwbacks, like Gok Wan, Mylene Class.
I used to get that.
But who else is there? Alexa Chung, and I think they're all of like mixed heritages, like part Caucasian, I think. But I don't really hear them talking about being like Asian. They have done more now, like in the last month. Mylene Class, who's a musician, she used to be in a band. She's been speaking about her experiences growing up, I think part Filipino, and the racism that she had when she was a child. But that's because she's joining in with this global conversation that's happening now. When I was growing up, I definitely didn't see her speaking about these issues. Can't really speak to why, but I suspect that it's because they don't want to out themselves as being different, or to have themselves funneled into only being seen as Asian, when actually they might get more opportunities if they were seen as like British first or white passing.
Makes sense.
I think with like Mylene Class, especially back then, because she came from that band Hearsay or whatever, and she's she's accomplished. Yeah, she's accomplished a lot. She's an entrepreneur. She's like a huge figure for like the women community. Do you know what I mean? She's a strong woman, and she's also Asian. And I think maybe it's not necessarily that she doesn't want to represent Asians. It's probably that the media doesn't really acknowledge Asian people, and therefore it drowns her out. Do you know what I mean? And back then there was like no such thing as social media either. Whilst right now it is a thing, and anyone has a voice. Back then is more what the media wanted to showcase to you.
Yeah, that's totally true. Like she could have been speaking up about Asian things in the past, but because they just edit it out, or it wouldn't be the headline, so you wouldn't hear about it. But now that she has her own platform, she's also like a classical pianist, like super talented. That's like a typical Asian thing, but she's super talented.
Yeah. She's amazing.
Just to jump in real quick, is it for the Singaporeans here, like, is it weird to hear us even talk about this? Like, is it just weird to hear us even complain or like have these issues?
No.
Like
I think,
what is it like to you listen to us?
I think it's something that we can all relate to and empathize with, but it's also because as Singaporeans, we've grown up with a lot of pop culture.
Yeah.
So we watch a ton of BBC programs, and we watch a lot of American programming also.
That's the colonialism.
That's the colonialism, right? Thank you. We
Shout out to the
spell color with
Brits.
a U.
Shout out to the Brits, man.
Actually-
They colonized everyone.
Actually, to kind of step in, just to put a little bit perspective of the people that you're talking here from Singapore, we are actually the ethnic minority in Singapore.
Yeah.
You can see we are actually talking to the Indians and the Malays, which are like maybe like 20% of the Singaporean population. Yeah.
So we
and
feel you
most-
guys, man. We
Yeah.
feel you guys.
Yeah.
So we feel you guys,
Yeah.
but we are on a different side now.
Yeah.
You get what we mean? Yeah.
Yeah, do you know what? Just to add into that, I mean, obviously there's a huge focus into the Asian community in this chat, but I think in England, I guess in America, it goes to all minorities, because that's what I was about to say. That, you know, how do you feel, you know, hearing British people talking about this? But I'm like, yeah, when I go to Malaysia, I still see Malaysian people still being somewhat discriminated against. Do you know what I mean? The Indian side and stuff, you know what I mean? So I think it's just minorities as a whole that are just somewhat pushed to the side.
Exactly. Yeah. So, like, you know, if you were to just cross the border, you would find that in Malaysia, because the Chinese and the Indians are more of a minority there, that they have more affinity with each other than maybe if you came over and then we saw that here maybe it's the Indians and the Malays that have more affinity with each other, since the Chinese are the demographic majority here. But I think one thing that unites the region quite a bit is anytime a Singaporean Chinese or a Singaporean Indian or a Singaporean Malay travels abroad, just by virtue of the accent, like once you hear, there is a stronger bond. I was just looking up an old speech from the 60s from Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore. And he was saying that this phenomenon has always existed, where people from this part of the world, Malaysia and Singapore, they have a lot of affinity with each other, more so than their ethnic groups. So I would have more in common with a Singaporean Chinese person that I met abroad than I would with an Indian of Indian origin, you know, or a South Asian in the UK.
Yeah, yeah. It
interesting,
actually makes sense. And you're such a small country, so it's like you have to stick together.
Yeah, pretty much. Like you're in a bus, and the moment you hear someone say "la," you turn around.
It's
like,
like-
I know what happened.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I would 100% agree with that. Like, so here in the UK, I don't know what the percentage is of, well, to give some context, all ethnic minorities or anyone who's non-white in the UK, they come under BAME, which is like stands for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic. So it's sort of our equivalent of saying people of colour. And yeah, I don't really see much like affinity or understanding in between those different groups. And I don't know if I'm cutting out. I'll give an example. So like in my like adult life, the only overt like racism that I've had, like people actually coming up to me in the street or on the train to say like racial slurs, they're people of other ethnic minorities. And I'm not saying that white people in England are not racist, it's just that they cover it up better. But that's just to give you some context. Like, in my experience, there isn't necessarily that understanding of we all get discriminated against, we all need to stick together, even though we all have this BAME label. I don't think it necessarily means anything.
Do you think it's because when you grow up, because there's so few Asians that, at least for me, I also grew up in an all-white neighborhood, and there's a sense of like, when you grow up and you're one of the only Asians, when you see other Asians, it's almost like, that's like my competition. I'm the Asian person in the group, like, you know what I mean? Like, so it's almost like you beef with each other more because you view them as like either jealousy or competitiveness to it rather than a sense of community because you don't grow up with that, and then you kind of find it later on in life. But I think like that exists at least on a tangential level, like in the structural society of the West, quite a bit, where it's like Asians kind of don't support each other or even minorities in a lot of ways. Do you feel like that's part of it at all from what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe there's this sort of like the white people can only accept a few of us. So who's it going to be? It can't be all of us. And maybe there is a sense of like stepping on each other or judging each other in our aspirations for success, which often comes down to like a very traditional white man's world, maybe.
Interesting.
Also, we know when you say Asians, that like in the UK, that kind of encapsulates a lot of like, you know, you encapsulate like Indians, you encapsulate Orientals, Filipinos and stuff. And what I find in London is that there's a lot of groups. Like when you think of like maybe East London, you think of the Filipinos. You know, when you think of like Elephant and Castle, you think of Colombians. You know, when you think of South London, you think of maybe Jamaicans and stuff. So like we are kind of like in different parts. Harrow, you may be like, oh, that's where most of the Indian community are. So when you think of Asians as a whole, yes, like everyone is sort of taking shots at each other, but they're not necessarily like, oh, Chinese. It's more, let's say, Chinese against Indians or whatever. So
yeah, I agree.
Right.
there is, it's actually, I want to ask you, John, when you say Asians in the US, what does that mean? Because in the UK, it's literally Asia. You know what I mean? I think of Indians, I think of Chinese, Filipinos, and stuff. It encapsulates everyone.
Yeah, that's fair. I think in the US, it means more East Asian because there's definitely a distinction between, I would say, Indian people and East Asian people and Southeast Asian people. I'm not gonna lie, in terms of like representation and also culturally, like basically if you're from an Indian background, there's actually quite a lot of culture that you guys have to reference to grow up with a completely different background. And yes, you're on the Asian subcontinent from your parents or parental or origin group, but it's a very different, I think, like, I don't think I would normally cross lines with them outside of like any other type of person to an extent. And it's not like I'm consuming their content or creating content for them that way. They actually have a very, very vibrant community within America. I think Southeast Asians, that's where it definitely lacks. And maybe like the people in Singapore can speak up for it, but it's not like there's that many Southeast Asian creators or people that are being shown online, right? It's to be honest with you, most of them are East Asian people. So I guess when I say Asians, it's mostly East Asian people. And I guess to that extent, maybe there should be more specific branding behind it. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough conversation too, because like I think you see this happen oftentimes in corporate settings where it's like businesses will be like, oh, we have representation for Asian people. Oh, and so our entire region is like all of Asia.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, what do you mean by that? Because are we just now getting lumped in with the same people that are from the Middle East too? That's also on the Asian continent, and like and India and like parts of Russia, and it's like, oh, so now like, but like you do not realize that like we all of us are not very, very unsimilar, and like, and if it wasn't for us literally working the same corporate company, there's no reason that we would all be lumped into the same category. So that's kind of the trouble, is that like it's not necessarily as black and white as like, let's say, an African American community or Latino community, because none of us are united by a common struggle per se. None of us are united by really a common bond, other than the fact that we simply may look similar, even though we don't really even look that similar, and that our ethnic origin comes from one continent, right? That's why it's like you can't even lump. It's like weird to even lump people into categories in that sense sometimes, but that's the way American society likes to work, and that's why there's a lot of tribal beasts all the time. You know what I mean?
No, I feel kind of different with that. Like where I'm at now, I actually think that if we're using the term Asian, we should use it inclusively, like not in the sense of lumping everyone together, but if we're going to say Asian, we need to actually look at the continent, all the different countries in there, and it's not just East, South, East, and South, it's also like Central and other parts. And Christian, I would actually disagree with what you said about moving. Like, I think we're moving towards Asian in the UK being used as East and South Asian, but I don't think we're quite there yet. And I actually think that East Asians being included in the word Asian, many times can I say the word Asian? But yeah, I think that's like an import from other countries like Australia and the US, where we do get a lot of media. And then I would say now, yes, I am Asian, but I didn't think that growing up. And I would say that I'm British, but I wouldn't say that I'm British Asian together, because to me, British Asian means South Asian, so India, Sri Lanka, Bengali, etc. And that's even represented like in our census form. So when we fill out government forms or when we go to the hospital, they have a subheading that says Asian, and then under there, you see Indian, Pakistani, etc. And then they have in another subheading, not under Asian, they have Chinese, and then they have other for all the other Asian countries. And because of how like that's how the government has always like collected data, and we always need to remember that when I'm reading like reports or anything in the news, that they might be separating Chinese from Asian, even though obviously China's in Asia, everyone knows that. I would love to know in Singapore and in the US on your census forms, what does it say? I know that in Singapore you have like the Eurasian as an official government term.
Yeah. So okay, so on that note, right? So I think we were talking about it before the other guys came in. So like even in my experience of traveling to visit folks back in the UK, that it was jarring for me as a Singaporean going there and finding out that Asian tended to mean South Asian, right? And that's what I wanted to ask: is the term Oriental, is that an offensive term? Because I think I've seen that classification used for East Asian people in the UK.
I wouldn't want someone to call me that unless they were like visibly East Asian.
Right.
Like, I wouldn't self-describe as that, but other East Asians might. I don't really know whether it is offensive or not, but I think maybe that's also an import from like American media to actually say that it's been used historically to otherize, and therefore we shouldn't use it anymore.
So like when it comes to, for example, Eurasians in Singapore, most people, even Singaporeans, are very oblivious about this. They're actually their own separate ethnic group. So most people tend to think Eurasians are biracial people. But these are people, a community that has come together as a result of, the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, and they have a community about 400 years, and where they've intermingled, have their own foods, their own dialect even. So it has experienced a bit of a decline in the last few, I think 50 or so years, because they tended to marry out. So either within the Chinese community in Singapore and the Indian community or even the Malay community, they marry out. And so there is a bit of effort to preserve some of the culture. But even within Singapore, like I used to go out with a Eurasian girl, and a friend of mine asked her, so what are you? And she's like, I'm Eurasian. And it's like, yeah, but what are you? Trying to get
I hate that
kind of ethnic breakdown. But for them, they're a distinct community by themselves. And then she just gave in and she's like, I'm Portuguese. So like just to end the conversation right there. Yeah, but so in Singapore, we tend to follow the broad racial classification. It's been actually 5 classifications. It's been Chinese, Malay, Indian, Eurasian, and then others. But in the last few years, people simplified to CMIO. So it's Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others. So the Eurasians are a bit of like the Targaryens of the old. They just vanished from history. Like no one kind of remembers them, but they've been a big part of Singapore's heritage and legacy. And even in Malaysia, there's still a thriving Eurasian community in Malaysia, actually. But they are the real children of the colonies.
Yeah,
dude, they're gonna come back with dragons, man.
Need to come back with dragons or curry, whichever works.
Oh man.
In Singapore, how do you see Europe and Britain? Because Singapore's still like such a young new country, like in terms of independence. So how do you see Britain in terms of, and British Empire and all that?
So we have a very interesting history and relationship with the West. So it's not as antagonistic as maybe we've seen some of the movements in the US and the UK. I think as a population, the stereotype is that Singaporeans can be a bit compliant and not very questioning of authority. But I think that's a bit more of a stereotype than anything. What we are seeing is a lot of people are following a lot of the movements abroad. So even among Singaporeans, we have a lot of self-identified social justice warriors. So and that does rub people off the wrong way, because in some sense, there's the feeling that they're just adopting Western movements wholesale with no idea of context. So in Singapore, a big buzzword is yellow privilege or Chinese privilege.
Oh, I haven't heard that before.
Yeah.
Yellow.
So, and that's a uniquely Singapore phenomenon, assuming that because the Chinese are the majority race, that we face systemic injustices or systemic oppression as a result of the Chinese majority. I don't know exactly how I feel about that, because there's a huge different cultural background. So in the case of like my grandfather, he came in as a subject of the British Empire, right? Because of Britain's colonization of India. And then when they were pulling out, they offered him English citizenship. So he would have been one of the guys running around Eastham if given an option, right? So but what happened was, right as he was about to leave with all his children, he saw Lee Kuan Yew, who was an ethnic Chinese man in Singapore, at a rally giving a speech, and he was like, you know what? I think I kind of, this guy's saying some real shit. Let me hang around and see how this goes. So there's a very big different dynamic, and there's a very different relationship with the West. I think primarily, despite the fact that we adopt terms like Chinese privilege in Singapore, or we look to the West and we empathize with the struggles, it's very different because no one here came in as a consequence of, example, slavery. So I don't think it's fair to adopt the struggles. Like we've had influencers in Singapore who tried to hijack Black Lives Matter, and they immediately changed it to Brown Lives Matter, and because they were teased in school for the color of their skin, and there was already a lot of pushback. Like, guys, don't appropriate this movement. This is not your time. Just take a back seat, and there's a time and place for these kind of grievances. So in Singapore, we do have a lot of Western influence, and with that is also the ideological stuff that gets sent over. And I don't think it's very sensitive to the history and context of what all of us faced growing up here.
Man, see, that's why I always want to move to Singapore, man. This yellow privilege.
You
want to be in the majority.
80% matches on Tinder, man. That's what you get.
Tinder, nice.
Yeah, dating privileges. That is something we need to talk about.
Okay, I've got a great segue to just show you how systemic some of the privileges are, or at least some of the biases are. So in Singapore, there is a law called Section 377A, right, that prohibits homosexual sex, right? So it's still prohibited in Singapore, but it's not police, but just by law. So these like gay people, like anywhere else, they view themselves as a very disenfranchised group. They don't get like similar rights as heterosexual people to get married and all that. But if you go on gay dating apps in Singapore, Chinese gay men will put no Malays and no Indians, please.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So just because you're a disenfranchised group in Singapore doesn't mean that all racism doesn't exist. So even in Singapore, gay Chinese men have exhibited, even they explicitly put it on their profile, that they would date only white men or Chinese men. So it's not a brush that you can paint and say that the experiences are very similar to everyone around.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think that's the same in the UK as well. So like a popular phrase maybe back in the day in the UK in like the gay dating scene was no fats, no femmes, no Asians. And that is like a well-known phrase now. I don't know whether it's still used. I can't speak to that. But I do know that, there is a trouble there when you are a minority within a minority. So you're like LGBT plus within an ethnic minority, or the other way around. And I actually have this here because I was looking at it this week, that in the UK, just over half of BAME, so ethnic minority LGBT people, face discrimination within their local LGBT network because of their ethnicity. So it's kind of like extra, like doubly like discrimination from both of their identities, which is tough.
In the UK right now, what I don't know. I think this is just like a good segue too. Like, what even is it like in the UK right now from the standpoint of a lot? I mean, I'm seeing there's the protests that have happened in America that have been ongoing currently have spread into other countries around the world, which initially was kind of mind-boggling to me because it was like, this is an American issue, right? Like this is an American killing and an American death. But clearly it's a deeper rooted issue elsewhere in the world. What has it been like in the UK, the response, and like how do you guys feel about it? I'm just curious what your perspective is.
I mean, from my take on it, although it happened in America, it's a worldwide thing, because you're discriminating someone just for the skin color. So I think the whole world is fighting for that equality, and that's why when you just said the whole Singaporean influencers were saying brown lives matter, I think it's important to keep the focus on what it is right now, because that's going to drip into everyone else. Personally, I come from a minority. I'm not black, but I would never understand what it's like to walk the streets as a black person. For the last 2 weeks, I've just been talking to my black friends, and what they experience is just ridiculous. So personally, although it happened in America, racism exists everywhere. Do you know what I mean? And that was something that I wanted to focus on my post in Pangaea when I made it. That it's important for people to acknowledge that it's not just an American thing; it's everywhere. One of my friends was telling me that when she went to China, people will pull on her head just because she was black. She was discriminated against. So it's important to highlight that it's everywhere, and it is amongst other minorities too. Do you know what I mean? It's not just white people. I get it. The focus is on white people in America and stuff, but it is everywhere. And I don't know if that's something that could also tie in with the whole yellow privilege thing that you were saying. But I personally feel that this is something that the whole world should be standing up to, and I think everyone has reacted appropriately. Everyone had their say, and I'm totally behind it.
I think just from a perspective of a Singaporean, I mean, I think so far the past 2 weeks, like because of the George Floyd incident and the whole uproar, like I think the past few days I've been like looking at news and trying to understand and listening to podcasts and listening to the history. So I think for me, from a perspective of the Singaporean, the reason why it has gone worldwide, because especially the countries like UK, America, Australia, Africa, there's a history of slavery with the black people. So you have the Edward Colston in UK, the statue being thrown because it's a slave trader, and then you have the apartheid incident in Africa. You have the color bar issue in Australia. And so there's this accumulation of oppression against black people, right? And it's just going on and going on and going on, and then it just takes a spark like George Floyd due to police brutality and aiming against black people to kind of spark that, and it kind of like exploded all the different dynamites worldwide. And then I think for us is I mean, like what Prav says, like we always like to hop on to things like that, like some of the young people, some of the teens, because we all like black culture, we all follow black culture, and we want to appropriate it to ourselves. But the fact of the matter is, you cannot do just that, because if you want to do that, you got to learn the history of the oppression of the blacks, like the slavery that they have to go through, the shit they have, the suffering. So which is why sometimes, like I think there was a podcast that we listened to about this kid, and the mom was saying the N-word all the time. And in Singapore, it's like it's fine because to him it's fine. And then he said like, oh, because I have a black friend, and then I said to him, hey, what's up with the N-word? And then he's okay with it. But if you were to look at it, it's just a sense of endearment that this black person has with this guy. But it does not mean that he can actually use it on everybody else, on any other blacks.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not right. It's never right. And even though that we have kind of like accepted black culture, by right, if we have understood the history, we shouldn't be even using those words. And I think overall, like as people living in the world, right, as of different colors and all that, it's essential for us to learn everybody's ethnicity, even whether you are a UK Asian or you are a Southeast Asian or you're an American Asian, because wherever you are, there is a history, like from the China vessels going into America. There might be history in there, so like you got to learn that, and then overall, then you can like kind of respect that. So like I think for me personally, when I'm looking at this whole thing, like I mean, I was young, I was immature sometimes. I would like throw like for us, because I'm half Indian, half Malay. So sometimes I would call the prof, ane. So ane means brother in Indian, but then like it might be derogatory to an Indian, but then I'll say like, hey, because I half Indian, so like half of me will feel it, but half of me won't feel it. But the fact of the matter is, it's not right, and we should always like remember that. And sometimes, I think because of this George Floyd incident, like people always say like, where's your? Some of us are voicing out, some of us are keeping quiet, but I think personally sometimes when people are too aggressive in voicing out, they cause people to those who are actually quiet and actually does not have knowledge to kind of like speak out, and that's where the stupid stuff happens, and that's where you have all these issues going back and forth, and then people are like arguing with each other and stuff like that. Yeah.
So like Bao, like something I want to build up on what Iqbal just said. So he spoke about an incident that happened really recently where a Singaporean woman, a woman and a son. The son's like a teenager.
Yeah.
They were on Instagram Live, and then the son repeatedly kept saying the N-word, and other Singaporeans watching it were calling them out on it. And the mom was like, "Oh, is it just a term of endearment, or I think she said it was a figure of speech, right?"
Yeah.
So, but one thing about Singapore that I think we do take a measure of pride in is that it's a hard fight for the last 50 years to build a society that can exist with this kind of racial harmony. And so I think like as of yesterday, you may argue that it's a violation of freedom of speech, but the police are investigating her. So, and this is for a community that doesn't exist in Singapore. She was out there saying a racial slur. In Singapore, when that happens, you can file a police report, and now she's under investigation. So I think that's some of the things that, as Singaporeans, we are a bit hesitant to comment on other countries because it come off as a bit chauvinistic, like, as if this tiny little island has got it all figured out and the rest of the world can take a page from our book. But
that's kind of what Britain did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We got it from you guys. We just added spices to it. So there is that element of racial integration, but so for example, what Iqbal also described is something that I'm a bit worried about.
Yeah.
So in Singapore, we've thrived on the exchange of cultures.
Yeah.
So every year we celebrate Racial Harmony Day in Singapore, and it's on the day of it's on the day of a very big riot that we had back in our history that was centered around ethnic lines.
Yeah.
And what typically happens is I would wear like a traditional Indian outfit to school on that day, or a Malay kid would wear his traditional outfit, and oftentimes people would swap. So a Chinese girl would wear like a sari, and maybe an Indian girl would wear a qipao or cheongsam, and she would come to school. But in the last few years, because we've adopted the narrative of cultural appropriation, now on Twitter I see local Singaporeans railing against that. Like, who says you can wear something from my culture? And I'm like, but dude, this has been the social glue that's kept it together. So even when Iqbal was like, now I'm going to think twice about calling an Indian guy Anne, I'm like, a part of me is like, are we losing something here if we lose this free exchange of ideas, of words, and these terms of endearment? Because we are adopting this ideology of sensitivity from something that's not really part of our culture. So what do you guys think about that? Like, how do you guys feel when you see someone wear Asian clothes, or and then maybe they're not part of the community? What's your general sentiment about things like that?
I guess it's difficult, and I wouldn't want to comment and say, oh, me as a British person, this is what I think you should do in Singapore at all. And it definitely sounds like you can't just have a paintbrush and say, you know what, everything has to abide by this rule, particularly if you already had that cultural exchange and that tradition. And for me, I guess it really depends on the context. And I've definitely been guilty of cultural appropriation myself in the past, but it's like we live and learn, and we're growing, we're all pushing to be better. But it definitely depends on the context. For me, I'm Chinese, but I wouldn't even know where to get like traditional Chinese or Malaysian dress. Like I wouldn't even know where to get it. And I would actually feel like I was appropriating some Asian culture, even if I was Chinese, if I was wearing like a cheongsam, because I really don't know anything about it. And I would be like buying it on eBay like a white girl. But I think it definitely depends on the context. Like, for example, if I was, like I've attended Indian weddings and worn a sari and a lehenga, but if that photo was taken out of context, someone could easily criticize me and say, who do you think you are wearing traditional Indian dress? That is not your culture. And I think that could be the same for a lot of people that I have in my network who have on occasion been sort of brought into a family event or a community event, been given things to wear and be of it. But if it was taken context, it's taken and they could get cancelled for it, to be honest.
Cancel culture.
I fucking hate cancel culture, but like I agree with you. It all has to do with context, because exactly like what you said, I see it more as a sign of respect. If you go to an Indian wedding and you're wearing you know, what everyone is there to wear, do you know what I mean? So it does come with context. If you're wearing something that doesn't belong to your culture and you're taking the piss out of it, then go get cancelled. You know, everyone should have a say. But I feel like in this day and age, everyone has a say, because everyone is behind the keyboard. Like no one is gonna go and put their face and be like, hey, it's me, I'm telling you. Okay, cool. If you're gonna tell me and you want to have a discussion, put your face against it, because if not, I'm gonna cancel you too. Do you know what I mean? I'm personally that type of person. If someone comes around talking shit to me, I'm gonna out them, and then we're gonna have a public conversation about it. Because if someone is willing to talk shit to me and no put their face behind it, then to me they're just jumping on a trend, because that's what it is now. If someone gets cancelled, they decide, oh, let's go and cancel him too. Let's go and chat shit to him, and I'm not about that.
Yeah, just to piggyback again, like to me, it's like one of the biggest issues of people even feeling like they need to cancel people to begin with is because they grow up, I think, in communities where they don't experience multiculturalism. Like, especially in America, because we're such a large country, there's just so many pockets and places around the country where if you're, let's say, a white person, you may not ever interface with a minority group at all. You might not ever feel in the minority, or even like, let's say, even just talk to a Black, Asian, minority person in your daily life. And that's the same case with a lot of African American communities, Asian communities. It's very siloed in like specific communities, to the point where like you don't get to have the perspective of people that are different from yourself. And so, of course, if you're never around other people that are different from yourself, you're not going to feel any sense of empathy towards a particular person or their struggle or their position and stuff like that. And so I feel like it's just very, very important to promote the development of like spreading your culture towards other people and like being open-minded enough to wanting to be around that culture, because that's what allows unity to be created to begin with. That's, I think, a lot of the reason why we don't have a lot of unity around the world, like we said, is because people kind of like stick to their own zone. So part of it's just traveling, part of it's just being open-minded enough, but also part of it is like not immediately saying, oh, hey, this person's trying to take on parts of someone else's culture. That's offensive. Well, everyone does that to an extent, you know? I mean, even in America right now, one of the biggest things is like with African Americans, it's like people think, a lot of them are saying Asians are appropriating Black African American culture because we like their music, or we want to play basketball like them and stuff like that. But it's like, to me, it's like, that's how you spread harmony to an extent. That's how you spread unity to an extent. Like literally a basketball court, for example, might be one of the only places where a white person, Black person, no matter what race you have, people will always just interface with each other on a basketball court, at least, because that's like a sport that unites all these people together. And I guess that, to me, that's just an example of it, but that's a place where racism doesn't really exist, right? It's not like a place where because of who you are, you're gonna be singled out to an extent. And that's like kind of like a concept to me that needs to get like permeated throughout more society to an extent, because we're not gonna become better by isolating each other more, or feeling like the other side is someone that I want to cancel and not allow them to even come in, because you're not going to improve the situation by doing it like that.
No, like John. So I remember this happened a couple of years ago with Jeremy Lin, right? I think it was another NBA player,
Yeah.
Kenyon Martin, right?
Yeah,
Called him
yeah.
out for having dreadlocks. But then Jeremy
Yeah,
Lin
yeah.
was like, dude, you have Asian, I think Chinese characters tattooed on your body. So
Yeah.
like there is an element of hypocrisy if you're going to be calling people out.
Oh, massive. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it goes both ways. People, no matter what, right? People can deduce it down to some element. Like, to be honest with you, if any person says, "Oh, like you're an Asian person, you're appropriating our culture," it's like, I mean, how far down this rabbit hole we're gonna go? Like, if we really want to go there, almost everything you own is probably manufactured in China to an extent. So, I mean, what are the levels that we're gonna go there, right? Like, I mean, and I wouldn't even say that. I wouldn't even say that, right? Like, I'm not even promoting like saying that, but it's just like you could literally find so many examples if you really wanted to like for this entire conversation to go down to that. It's just like, to me, it's like, why are we even having this conversation to begin with? Like, I'm trying to be your friend. Like, I'm trying to figure out how Jeremy Lin and Kenyon Martin can hang out and be the same teammate on a team and win an NBA championship together. Why are we trying to like distance ourselves even further? You know, like that to me is a larger conversation that needs to be held. To be honest with you, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, bro. You go. I'll pitch in after.
Oh, I was just gonna end off with saying, like, to be honest with you, none of this really even matters if it doesn't start from the people in the majority having an open mind to me, because at the end of the day, all of us are the collective minority groups in our respective countries, and it doesn't really matter until the people in the majority lean into feeling like they're consuming and sharing and like being open-minded enough to speak to people in minority positions and you know bridge the culture that way, because they're the ones with the power to an extent to actually influence that change. So yeah, that to me is like when things actually start shifting.
Yeah, what I was gonna say is that is mainly like a Western mentality, because when I'm traveling, man, I've gone to so many countries and they welcome me with open arms. They want me to wear this stuff. Do you know what I mean? And I love embracing culture, but it's now if I go and post it on social media and I'm here getting involved and appreciating people's culture, then people are like, you don't belong to it. Like, what are you doing? Like, you're a disgrace. You're just being disrespectful. I'm like, but they don't think so, you know? And if anything, they're more, they're experiencing that culture more because they live there. You're out there in London talking shit to me. You've never been to Asia. You come from an Asian background, but you probably have never even stepped foot in this country, and you're talking shit to me. You know, so it's more of a Western mentality.
For sure. Oh my god! Every single time I've ever traveled to Asia, it's always like, I guess partly it might be because I'm Asian, but you just feel a greater sense of belonging because it's so tribal in Western culture, right? It's so like you versus me, and if you're not with us, you're not a part of us. It's like that mentality, I think, is just like, it has to go to an extent, because if everyone just traveled, to be honest with you, and went outside of their home country and got to experience what it was like living somewhere else and the people there, and you realize like how similar you are to other people around the world, and it's not really that different other than the fact that maybe you have a certain different life experience growing up, but that you're not fundamentally different just because you grow up with a different color skin or a different country. Like I can relate to even like all you got people in Singapore, people in the UK, in a lot of ways more than I can a lot of Americans, because they didn't go through similar struggles to me. They might have similar perspectives. They didn't do certain things. So it's like I at least I would just encourage people to go travel. That's definitely one of the most life-changing perspectives that I've ever experienced in terms of like opening my mind up to things.
100%.
All right, guys, I want to do a bit of a check-in right now. So Christian, do you have something to add on to that?
No, we can move on. I have a lot to say.
We could go on for ages.
We are vibing a lot, so I want to know what are you guys comfortable with in terms of time. Like, could we go on another 15 minutes? Anything more than that?
I would say this. I will say this. I'm supposed to be working right now. John sent me the link, and I was just like, I love John. I have to jump in. Now I'm vibing with everyone. So hey, I'll happily do an all-nighter on this job and have this conversation. No, because I feel like these conversations need to be had. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm here for it. I'm here for it.
Well, what about you, Natalie? What about John? Like, what's comfortable?
I'm gonna go until 0:00, then I'm gonna go for my dinner Zoom. But not to say that we can't do this again because I'm loving it.
How long more is it?
20 minutes?
20 minutes?
Yeah, it's 20 more minutes.
23 minutes to be precise.
Okay.
All right, quick, get on the topic.
All right, so let's do a quick pivot. Let's do something a bit juicier. All right, let's see. Maybe Christian and Natalie, I want to hear your perspectives on this, right? So, I mean, you guys are minorities from different communities, right? Is there a pressure, do you find, as a British Asian, or what would you call your Bristol, a British Colombian, right, to date
Colombian?
No, to date within the community. Like, what's the perception if you date outside the community? What's it like? And then after John can chime in with the Asian American perspective.
Are you Colombian?
I'm Colombian, yeah.
Oh shit! I didn't
Pay
know.
attention, Natalie.
Hey, his last name is Escobar. Come
So you're
on.
talking about me, and I was like, no, I'm Chinese.
Wait, did you think I was Asian?
Huh? I don't
Did you
know.
think
I
I
was
was
looking at your
Asian?
surname, like I don't know.
There we go. Erasing people all over again. That's what we do here.
Try not to make assumptions.
Actually, I would love to hear what Natalie has to say about this first, and then I'll.
But I
I'll
didn't
pitch
even
it.
hear the question. I was too distracted because I was worried I said
Okay.
something racist.
So is there pressure among British Asians or British Chinese to date within the community? How's the perception like if you date outside? Is there, what's the dating scene like if you're dating within the British Asian community? Like, do you date first generation ones? Do you date expatriates who just come in fresh off the boat? What's it like? What's the whole experience like?
There definitely is like a mix of cultures, especially like being based in London and stuff. You grow up and interact with different people. Having said that, I do think that people are more biased to either date within their own ethnicity or with white people. And we all know that the Asian girl, East Asian girl, and white man, that is like a very common couple combination. John's staking his head because he's nodding his head. I don't know what's happening, but
Yeah, he's like, you know what? I'm gonna go to Singapore and show
The
you
white
guys.
people.
yeah, you need to go to Singapore and get that yellow privilege.
But Nelly, like, is there a form of fetishization? Like, have you felt that personally?
Oh
or
god, yeah.
not feel that?
Yes.
All right. Now we go. Right, let's go.
All the time. It happens all the time. Like I could be in a bar and then people just think it's like a conversation starter. You know, everyone gets asked this, where are you really from? And it's just so infuriating because, okay, sometimes like people will ask you, where are you from? Where are you really from? But they don't even care about your answer. They start guessing straight away, Korean, Japanese. And I'm like, are you going to let me reply? Or were you just trying to project your things onto me? And yeah, they just want to box you. They just want to label you. And yeah, I am Chinese. I'm proud to be Chinese. But then sometimes that comes with a lot of stereotypes with that. And then often with like the whole yellow fever and everything, people like to pull on whatever association they have with whatever country they think that you're from or connected to. So if I say like, yeah, I'm British Chinese, and then they say like, oh, I spent a year in Beijing last year. I'm like, good for you. What do you want me to say? Like that happens like all the time, and I guess it's cool because you know they're learning about Chinese culture. I appreciate that, but often they just want to show off how much they know about Chinese culture, which I don't. Like I'm just like, okay, you can just ask me like, do you come here often? You don't need to start telling me about your gap year. Like,
Right.
Well, what about you, Christian? What's your perception?
Okay, so for me, being Colombian, I guess it's welcome. You know, like we're very welcoming people. If for whatever reason we end up dating outside our own culture, if anything, is celebrated. You know, the whole thing of like, you know, embracing other cultures and being a bit more exotic is like a huge thing in Colombia. So, and also Colombians, like, I don't know what a Colombian looks like. We're black, we're white, we're brown, we're everything. I mean, look at me. Even Colombian people don't think I'm Colombian, you know?
Right.
So we come in, so yeah. So what I wanted to pitch in is that most of my girlfriend, if not all, have been Asian, and I've actually been on the other side
Oh,
of.
so you're the guy with yellow fever, right? Got it.
No.
John was about to leave this chat. Like, he's gonna leave the room.
Wow.
No. I wouldn't quite say it like that, but for me, I've been on the other side of, if we want to kind of bring it back into a little bit of like racism or maybe stereotypes, I've been on the other side of, their family not necessarily accepting me. I mean, it depends on which, because I've been out with a Thai girl who was amazing. Her parents welcomed me in, although they did have this stereotype, oh, Colombians are lazy. I'm like, you would never, ever, if you knew me, you would never call me lazy. Like, I'm always active, so, But I did have this huge kind of thing with Malaysian Chinese. She was one of my ex-girlfriends. And her family, before we started dating, we were in school together, like her family loved me. And as soon as they found out I was dating her, they said that I was going to ruin their bloodline. And because I'm not Chinese, I am dirt, And I've experienced that firsthand, from her being like, her mom being like, I love you, like, I wish you were my son. And then the day she found out, I was on the phone and she was like, he's dirty, he's not from our blood. And I just couldn't believe it. So I've been on the other side of not being welcomed into a family just because of my heritage.
Natalie, anything to say from the Malaysian Chinese delegation?
Well, I think there's a big difference between wanting to date within your ethnicity for like cultural reasons and then actually sort of saying something like he's dirty. That's too much, like there is a line. Like, I feel like wanting to date within your ethnicity because you want to have that culture and you have more in common, that's okay. But then if you're discriminating against that, and it kind of just shows that even if they were accepting of you before they knew that like you dating them was a possibility, it shows that this stuff was always ingrained in their head. Like, they always thought this stuff, but they were like, friendship is okay apparently.
Yeah, I mean, and then since then, she never looked at me. They owned a restaurant, and I remember I wanted to go in and talk to her. I wanted to go in and talk to her, and I actually went in like after 3 weeks, and I was just like, hey, I came here because I want to talk to you. I want us to be on good terms. And then she said, get out of my restaurant. I never want to see you again.
Oh, wow. Shit! Extreme, dude.
Yeah. So
what happened, man?
I mean, her brothers were okay with it. Her dad seemed okay with it, but her mom was just like a straight up nope. I never want to see you again. And it's so funny because we broke up like around 5 years ago. And her mom works in another restaurant that I go to quite regularly with my Asian friends. And whenever she sees me, dirty look, like guaranteed dirty looks on this. Like, I feel like it's more like old traditional values, because now everyone is becoming more westernized. Everyone is becoming more acceptance of being just kind of falling in love, and doesn't matter where you're from, blah, blah, blah. But it's an old kind of mentality where it's like, you need to be within your own race or else you're not welcome.
Like, John, I would love for you to comment on this, but I'm going to add a little bit in, because I remember when you guys came to Singapore, I remember talking to the Fang Bros, and both of them echoed sentiment, which is that wherever in the world that they went, they always felt that Asian men would just have such a strong preference for dating Asian women, but that it was not the same with Asian women. Asian women are more comfortable dating outside their cultures. So what do you think about that perception?
Oh man. Well, I think culturally, and this is like on a global societal issue, I think a lot of what people desire in our society is based upon the way we are showcased within media, because that is oftentimes people's touch point towards what is their representation of what that person is like. And so when it comes to representation, Asian women are fetishized in predominant Western culture in a lot of ways, because of the fact that they are deemed exotic, but also because when they are represented in media and films, they're represented in ways that by and large are closer to an accurate depiction than men are. Because if you think about it, Asian men are either just very stereotypical and negative Asian stereotypes. Like they're like the nerd, the person that gets bullied, the person that just does kung fu. Like you can't name like one Asian American male that's in Hollywood that like represents a very strong like modern day Asian male to an extent, right? For a movie that's come out, I think it's obviously improving in a lot of ways, but yeah, the disparity between men and women is very different. I don't think it's an excuse, but I think, but it is very interesting the differences, because it's just a gap that you have to close again within your own community, and it's like, I think that's part of the reason why, as Asian Americans, it can feel like not everyone is always on the same side, right? Because I at the end of the day, I don't have a problem with people dating outside the race. Like, you know, I think like I said, I think it's a positive thing. But at the end of the day, if it's a disproportionate level of people dating outside the race for men or women, it's an extremely large disparity.
Yeah.
It creates like it creates a feeling that some people aren't necessarily within the community as like other people, and so that's and honestly, to me, that was a big inspiration to why I wanted to get into film. I was working a corporate job in the past, and I was really displeased with just like the fact that even within my own workplace, people would racially discriminate against me. I remember I had a boss, not my direct boss, but I had like a person that was in upper management, and he was an African American, and it was my first time meeting him in a meeting. It was just me, him, and then another white person, who's also in upper management, and we were all meeting for the first time, and it was like 10 minutes into the conversation, and I remember him putting his hand on me at one point, because it was like I think I was like struggling to understand what he was saying, because it was like my first time meeting. I was like, can you clarify what you meant by that? And he like puts his arm on my shoulder. He just goes, you know, son, if I could say this to you in Japanese, I would, but unfortunately I can't. So I'm just gonna have to say it to you like this.
God.
And I was like,
fuck.
and I was like, and like that's just like one of the many moments where you're just like, come on now, like this is exactly why there needs to be more representation, because I'm not Japanese. I definitely don't need you to translate what you said into a different language for me, right? And it's like, it just happens so often. So and I know this happens to so many people around, even the world, to be honest with you, that it's like, change is not going to happen until you take action into your own hands. And I think a lot of people just are unwilling to make that change happen. And so, yeah, I mean, it exists on many, many levels. I would say overall, as Asian people, I think we need to do what we can to support each other and to uplift each other, and put more people with more regular looks into representative roles within film, because that will help other people understand and struggle better. And that actually goes for almost every single community. So, I mean, that's what, at least to an extent, I do what I do now. I don't know if that was too deep or.
No, we do still have some time. So like, if one of you guys want to shoot out a question, like at least for us to munch into the last 10 minutes, this is the time, man.
I gotta say something though. So when Christian mentioned that there's a saying that Colombians are lazy. Am I right? There's a saying. So I can empathize with that, because so I can empathize with that, because we Malays, we are classified as that in Singapore. Malays are considered lazy in Singapore. So there's memes going around saying that, do you know why the Malays cannot succeed? It's because you're lazy. You know, something like that. So it's been going around, and it's a stereotype that they kind of perceive, because they often see Malays like hanging around under our homes, under our HDB flats, where we'll just like hang around in groups, play the guitar, not doing anything productive, and it's just a passing remark saying that we're lazy. So that's the exposure that they get from the Malays, which is they conveniently kind of pass it off.
Yeah, I mean, like, stereotypes are always going to exist, you know, whether you're racist or not. You're always going to exist. But it's more when it's like you don't even give that person a chance to prove themselves, or to like, you know, to show you that they're different or whatever, and you just classify them as like, no, you're going to ruin my bloodline, fuck off. Like, that's when I'm just like, that's a strong sense of racism there. Like, I just can't respect.
That's crazy.
Actually, I have a fun fact. I mean, not a fun fact. I have a history. I have a story to head on to that. So similar to your case, my ex-girlfriend, she was an Indonesian Chinese.
Is your wife asleep now?
My wife's asleep. She's
Okay,
asleep. She knows. So my ex-girlfriend is Indonesian Chinese. So I vibe well with her and her siblings, but not with her parents. Like the dad will assume that all Malays are a no-go, because so I kind of managed to deep dive into this and found out that it all goes back into history. When the dad was younger, or there was one point in time, their family was in Indonesia, and there was a civil riot going on between the Chinese Indonesian and the Malay Indonesian. So what the Malay Indonesians will do, they will protest on the roads, and they will actually go into their homes and ransack everything. So the dad and his family kind of experienced that, and I know it could be a traumatic experience for them. I assume it will be, and that's when he said no Malays interaction at all. Yeah, so then I kind of have empathy to that.
Yeah,
it's all traditional values, I guess.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a very interesting anecdote, Zeke, like about the kind of context that we have in Asia. Because in Indonesia, a lot of the Chinese migrants, by law, were not allowed to keep Chinese surnames. They weren't allowed to have Chinese shop fronts, so you can't see like Mandarin characters on the shop fronts. They weren't allowed to celebrate Chinese New Year, like in the sense of hanging lanterns out in the streets and things of that sort. So they experience a lot of systemic racism within the Indonesian context. And then here you are, after that, facing the backlash of that, like generations after.
Yeah.
So it's but I think that's what we are facing here. Like in a lot of in a strange way, we just by going across like the next island in Asia, and you'd see an entirely different Asian dynamic between like a minority group and a majority group, and it gets pretty intense. So we have about 5 minutes in. I think when we wrap things up, let's give everyone here a chance to plug in their stuff. So Natalie and Christian, and I think John, we've got his plug from before, but please feel free to do it again. So Nat, maybe you can tell us where to find you, what your handles are, and why they should check you out.
Yeah, so I recently started a podcast called Yellow Bee Pod. We're highlighting stories from East and Southeast Asian diaspora. So if you want to learn more about a UK perspective, definitely a voice that doesn't get heard enough, come check us out at Yellow Bee Pod.
I just followed you, by the way, on what's it called? Spotify.
All right, sweet, thank you.
Already paying dividends.
Please let me know your thoughts if you listen, because you have the British Asian community.
You have quite a few episodes as well, so yeah.
So what about you, Christian? You've recently had a social media exodus. So do you want people to find you? What's up? Like where should they find you?
I mean, if you want to find me, Instagram at ic.escobar, icescobar.com. Yeah. For the meanwhile, I'm pretty sure I'll make my ways further down the line this year, and then hopefully make some sort of impact.
Yeah, just remember, guys, we had him here first before he becomes huge. All right, we spotted him fast.
Oh, and also, I mean, I did start this Instagram page called Pangea, which, you know, when I started traveling, I felt like there was a lack of focus on other cultures on Instagram. It was just about going to a country to get the one picture, you know, oh, I was there, and you dismiss the locals, you dismiss culture. So I'll make this page to kind of put a highlight on all cultures around the world. So if you want to go check that out, that's at Pangea, or Pngaea.
I have a lot of respect for that message.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really passionate about this, honestly.
One of the best Instagram pages I follow. To this day.
Thank you.
To this day.
To this day.
To this day.
To this day.
Oh, damn. Yeah.
Awesome.
So, Zeke, do we need a plug from John?
I don't know, John, feel free.
All good.
Nah, forget
all good.
John. Forget.
Do you
Just,
want to
Getting
use
too
footage?
popular.
John, give us a plug, man. Give us a plug. Brand new.
No, I mean, honestly, I think it was a good conversation with Natalie and Christian. I enjoyed hearing you guys' perspective. Honestly, I think this could be a part of a larger conversation. I feel like we kind of just started with the tip of the iceberg in terms of a lot of the details. So I'm sure we'll probably stay in touch. But yeah, you guys should all go check out our podcast. Go check out his Instagram page.
Right.
And
Okay, John,
there'll be
on
a
that
lot more
note,
fascinating conversations.
on that note, like what is the topic that you would like to cover maybe in the next session, just to give our viewers a little bit of a taste?
Shit, I was gonna ask. I mean, maybe I'll ask Natalie and Christian. Do you guys have any people that you would recommend us talk to? Where should we? Is there anyone that you could like recommend? Because I think for us, we've been kind of adopting this mantra, just talking to people around the world, and just talking about like these topics, like kind of relevant events within the creative field. Like, I would love to try and reach out to people elsewhere in Asia or elsewhere around the world. So maybe we'll kind of do some reach outs. But if you guys have anyone in mind to reach out to, we would definitely do that as well.
Not
Any
right now, but I think
recommendations?
it is good to get experiences from different countries, particularly countries where like we might not think that there's a diaspora community there.
Yep.
But yeah, I'll have a think.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Right.
Okay,
Next,
I mean-
we have a wrap. Okay,
Cool.
We're wrapping up.
we're wrapping up. All right, we can
Hey
linger
guys,
around.
so that.
What do we
Thanks,
do?
guys.
Big thank you.
Appreciate
Bye.
All right. Remember to like and subscribe. Okay, I got it.
You need to point like subscribe here. I don't
Like,
know, man.
subscribe. Don't get confused with the post-it. Like,